Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements. I'm your host, Desmond Cole, and as we continue our federal election 2025 coverage here on the podcast, we have two guests joining us this week. Our first is Pam Palmater. Pam is a lawyer, professor, writer, and a member of the Eel River Bar First Nation. She is the chair of Indigenous governance at Toronto Metropolitan University, a regular media commentator, and the author of several books, including Indigenous Nationhood and Warrior Life. Welcome back to the show, Pam.
Hey, Desmond.
Great to see you. And of course, we're joined by Martin Lukacs, the managing editor of The Breach. Hey, Martin.
Hey, Desmond, and great to have you back, Pam. It's been too long.
For sure. So we've got a lot to get into today, Pam, and we would love to hear your thoughts, I guess, just to open this conversation today about the election in general. We're, I guess, getting close to about halfway through this campaign, and a lot has happened. What are your thoughts? What are your reflections so far?
Well, my first thought is I feel very vindicated. For the last 6 months, every time I was interviewed in the media, they're like, so Pam, what are you going to do with a conservative government? And I kept saying, hey, the writ hasn't dropped yet. Don't assume that the Conservatives are winning. Anything could happen. And sure enough, Trump happened, and now we're all topsy-turvy. I mean, in a really striking sense. So for me, it was like, oh, okay, because none of the leaders have that like perfect combo. But oh my goodness, there is nothing worse than Pierre Poilievre. So I was like, yeah, Liberals or NDP, please, someone rise to the top. So that's where I am right now. That being said, I am still a bit icky that Mark Carney is not really strong out there on Indigenous issues like the Trudeau government was for the last 9 or so years. It is causing me quite a bit of concern.
You've taken me to a few places that I kind of wanted to go. So let's start with this story about Mark Carney distancing himself from his late father, who I didn't know actually until the story surfaced last week, that Mark Carney's late father, Robert Carney, was actually a principal at an Indian day school called Joseph Burr Tyrrell School. And this is back in the 1960s. And there's actually archival CBC footage of him speaking about his view of some of the students at his Indian day school. I just want to preface these comments by saying I know this is a very difficult topic for some people and that this can be very triggering and re-traumatizing. So I want to give that warning before I continue. But Robert Carney made some comments about students who he believed couldn't learn, who he referred to as, quote, culturally retarded children. And he also made some comments about how, they had not been in regular attendance at school, and that, he described such children as, falling behind in their studies, but also kind of in general had this idea that we should be grateful for a lot of the good things that Indian residential schools did. He kind of pulled a Lynn Bayak on us and said, what about all the good things? So he's distanced himself. Mark Carney has distanced himself from his father's comments. And I wonder, what's your reaction to this story, Pam, and to the broader implications for his campaign?
Well, I see a lot of comparison between Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, because remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, they are the ones who came up with the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy, which was like, just get rid of the Indians, get rid of reserves, no more treaty rights. And there was a big blowback. And so when Justin Trudeau came in, that was one of the first questions posed to him. And he had to make a choice. He had to say, no, you know what? I stand with my father's White Paper, or, that's not us. Like we've developed as a party and we're not going there anymore. And I don't support the White Paper. So my concern was when the story first came out that I didn't hear anything from Mark Carney. And I was like, oh no, because your silence could be taken as you support what your father said. I mean, you can't do anything about what parents and uncles and cousins and boyfriends and girlfriends do, but he needed to speak to it. So I think it took him a little long to speak to it, which was causing me concern. But when he came out and said, I love my father, but I don't stand by those comments, and we're on a different journey and we've learned, okay, that's fair. You can't do anything about what your family's done, but you need to speak to it and you need to say, yeah, I'm in line with that or I'm not.
And what about your critique earlier just now about his broader policy? So, like, okay, Mark Carney's distanced himself from his father on this particular issue, but what about his broader approach to Indigenous affairs? We are living in the era of the aftermath of the reconciliation era of Justin Trudeau, and Carney inherits that. So, are we looking for a darker time? I mean, is he going to be, in your view, from what he's been saying, less committed to a relationship with Indigenous nations than his predecessor Trudeau was?
So I don't think it is his primary focus like it was with the Trudeau government. I mean, it has pretty much always been a huge focus. No relationship more important than the one with Indigenous peoples. And he did lots of great things and some horrible things. Here, I don't hear that. I get that he is playing to the fact that we have this crisis of Trumpism in the United States and this tariff war and what that could mean for the change around the country. However, that can't come at the cost of Indigenous peoples and this path of reconciliation, because reconciliation, as you know, is not a moral thing. We're talking about legal rights. We're talking about land. We're talking about, UNRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there's these things that are already in play and already in place. So UNRIP's already in place. National Inquiry's already in place. There's an action plan already in place. So if he carries on with what the Trudeau government was working on, then that'll be okay. But he needs to speak to that. And then the other thing that really raises my alarm bells would be the continuation or maybe even fast forward of what Trudeau is doing with pipelines and mines. So approving pipelines, being okay with RCMP coming in and brutalizing Native people, criminalizing unarmed land defenders. The way he's talking about energy and being an energy superpower and all of that stuff is really reminiscent of the things that Doug Ford has said, about the Ring of Fire. I'll jump on the bulldozer if I have to and get those minerals. I hope that's not the road he's going down, because the whole legal landscape has changed and he's not going to get a friendly greeting if that's the way he proceeds.
We're to talk more about resource development as we go on here. Martin, let me get your thoughts about about Carney and about what he has kind of offered here in terms of relationships with Indigenous nations.
I mean, maybe that was a Freudian political slip, because I'm personally concerned that there isn't that much to distinguish Carney and the Trudeau approach ultimately from the Conservatives. I have tended to think that there is a very big difference in terms of tone and tactics, but I've always found that the underlying strategies pursued by Liberal governments are very similar to the ones pursued by Conservatives. The bottom line agenda is still there. Extinguishing title to Indigenous lands, granting First Nations, the power of no more than mere municipalities, and really trying to abolish Indigenous nations as sovereign people. And I do think that, Pam has written very insightfully about this, but the splashy reconciliation agenda, the elaborate consultations, the profuse apologetic tears, very often disguised that agenda. And what's interesting is I don't think Carney has the same political skills to do that kind of reconciliation politics. So I am worried that we're going to see more of that glove off approach that we had from previous Liberal leaders like Chrétien, like Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. I am worried about that.
Now, Pam, when it comes to the difference between the Liberals and Conservatives, such as it exists, we do see this much more forward, like an out in the open direction from Pierre Poilievre about how he's going to frame his approach to Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous nationhood, resource development. And what he has basically tried to do is say, look, it is all about resource development. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people want resources to be harvested for their benefit in this country. I'm going to give it to them. For example, he has this kind of one and done approach that he's calling for resource development. I'm going to read a quote from a conservative press release about this, a campaign announcement. Conservatives will also establish the Canadian Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, the CIOC, to offer loan guarantees for local Indigenous-led resource projects. And he's making his approach, Pam, all about this offering that you guys want these minerals and this oil out of the ground. I'm going to help make your communities prosperous. That's the much more direct, I think, Poilievre approach. Your thoughts?
Oh, exactly. So this is, hey, I could care less about Native people and Native rights and anything that's happening to them, anything that we've done. Oh, but if you have our minerals, we will loan you money so that you can take those minerals out for us. And I guarantee this so-called economic reconciliation he's talking about, you don't see a high emphasis on revenue sharing or environmental protection or letting Indigenous peoples decide what happens on their lands, how much comes out, if any comes out, what alternative plans there could be, or maybe nothing comes out, which is a clear ignoring of the fact that the federal government passed Bill C-15, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that federal laws and policies have to change to abide by all of those rights that are guaranteed in UNRIP, which free, prior, and informed consent is kind of like the glaring one, and the right to decide what happens to our lands and resources, which includes water, things above the ground, and minerals below the ground. So that's always concerned me, always. I am so hoping Carney doesn't go down that same path, but I haven't heard anything different. And so sometimes you can take that as the same thing. But yeah, Poilievre would just literally be, shovels in the ground. If you want a loan to be part of it, you can, which just seems ridiculous to me.
And Martin, let me ask you to pick up on that in another sense, because there's been a lot of attention paid to a candidate who some people wanted Pierre Poilievre to drop in British Columbia. His name is Aaron Gunn. And people were demanding that Poilievre and the Conservatives remove him from the race, in part because of some comments that he made 3 years ago, saying that what happened in the residential school system was not a genocide. And, he still has the tweet up where he made these comments. Quote, "There was no genocide. Stop lying to people and read a book. The Holocaust was a genocide. Get off Twitter and learn more about the world," unquote. So Martin, he didn't drop Gunn. Gunn is still the candidate in British Columbia. Now the deadline's passed. So your thoughts about, again, he puts this kind of, when people were calling for Gunn to resign, Poilievre said, well, not only is he a great candidate and we're going to keep him, but he's also really committed to helping Indigenous communities harvest these resources. It's just this one note on everything having to do with Indigenous peoples in Canada.
I think Gunn had another tweet where he said that Indigenous peoples, in fact, asked for residential schools, which may have been the worst comment of all. I think it's worth reflecting on not just how Poilievre is refusing to distance himself from such individuals or dropping them as candidates, but I think it's a reflection very much of his own worldview. And I think it's been interesting that Poilievre, if we look at him historically, over the last 15 years, he's said very little about Indigenous issues. And the reason, I think, is because back in 2008, he so abysmally stuck his foot in his mouth. And I think it's worth just reviewing that. I think some of our listeners might know about it, but it reveals a lot about him. It was 2008, and Prime Minister Harper was prepared to issue an apology for the horrors of the residential school system. And it's worth remembering that this wasn't some sincere act of contrition. It had been mandated by an agreement that had been signed by the Assembly of First Nations and Paul Martin's Liberals, who were trying to head off a class action lawsuit. And the day of the apology, Poilievre took to a local right-wing AM station where he basically questioned the compensation for those, he said, who partook in residential schools, which made it sound like it was some voluntary excursion that kids went on. And more than that, he also said, are we really getting value for all of this money? And is this money really going to solve the problem? He wasn't clear about what the problem was, but then he went on about, he doubled down and tripled down and said a lot of things that I think revealed what is fundamentally a very bigoted, racist worldview. He said, look, we spend $10 billion a year on Indigenous issues, neglecting to mention that, of course, this is a Crown obligation to provide services and programs, which in any case our First Nations receive at a far lower rate than Canadians do. And then he made it seem like Indigenous people are these, living in these cesspools of corruption and mismanagement. He says there's too much power concentrated in the hands of the leadership on reserves. It makes you wonder where all this money is going. And then he said that basically what we need to do is engender the values of hard work and independence and self-reliance, which to my mind is straight out of the colonial worldview that created residential schools in the first place. And I think this is not just a view that he held. He was just more brazen in his willingness to say it out in the open. I think it's something that is deep within the Conservative Party and especially deep within the current of the Reform Party that he grew out of. And I think we've seen now that those impulses, those essentially racist and colonial impulses, keep coming up now in different forms through residential school denialism, because I think they understand that it's not kosher anymore to share those things out in the open. So now they're whistleblowing in more subtle ways.
Pam, let's talk about the NDP, the New Democratic Party, and Jagmeet Singh, their leader, a little bit, because as a contrast to the other two major federal parties, Jagmeet Singh has actually been more attentive to a lot of the issues that we've raised already. He has said he wants to implement fully all of the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He wants to implement all of the recommendations in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Girls, Women, and Two-Spirit People report. He wants a full settlement for child welfare imbalances that the federal government under Trudeau was actually fighting nations in court around. He says that was ridiculous and he wants to go in a completely different direction and resolve that. He has basically said, I want to kind of fulfill a really broad set of promises to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people that haven't been kept in this country. But then, of course, there's the issue that he's quite far behind and falling in the polls and may not have the influence that he has even previously had in this past government to influence what goes on. So what are your thoughts about that?
It is so easy to promise the world when you know you don't have a chance of forming even a minority government. In fact, there's even a bit of a chance that NDP could lose all of their seats. So yeah, promise the world. It's kind of like when the Green Party says, we will fix all environmental issues. We'll do everything Indigenous people ever asked for. These are great things to say, and I appreciate that coming from them, but they both know they're going to have zero impact on anything that happens going forward. We are in a situation where it's liberal or conservative. Right now, we know that the liberals have done some of those things. They had the biggest compensation settlement with First Nations on First Nations child welfare in the billions, like bigger than any other settlement that's ever been with Indigenous peoples, instead of going to court and hashing it out. That's great. Part two is the long-term reform, where the Liberals couldn't get an agreement from all of the First Nations across the country, so they only settled with Ontario. now the call is, hey, you need to have some arrangement with the First Nations in the rest of the country. It's not just Ontario that has these issues. So, that's the hope going forward. But, the NDP, well, they're just so ineffectual, and they haven't been effectual. Their communications, they've been silent on so many issues over the last year or two that, one has to wonder if he just fizzled out. He's not even saying he wants to be prime minister anymore. It's just, we could be effective in opposition. Well, you maybe not even get any seats. So it's kind of a non-starter for me, sadly.
Martin, your thoughts?
It's funny because in the last episode, I said I was a bit relieved that at least he's not talking about running for prime minister anymore, and that there might be a better chance that they maintain some of their really strong MPs, which there are a number. But I agree with Pam that at the party center, especially among the consultants who run the party, I've never really felt a deep commitment to serious long-term Indigenous solidarity and Indigenous rights. I think that's different among some of the MPs across the country, but unfortunately they don't set the agenda of the party. The brass in Ottawa do.
Pam, I wrote a piece during the first week, I think, of the election campaign, and it was about Pierre Poilievre's criminal justice approach and the many so-called tough-on-crime policies that he's been putting forward. We've heard this very much before from Conservatives. It is essentially a rebrand of the Stephen Harper era, mandatory minimum sentences, tougher on bail, not allowing prisoners to serve sentences in the community. And when I was researching for this piece, it struck me that those last three things that I just listed are all explicit demands as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. They talk about the harmful effects of mandatory minimums, of reduced and restricted bail and parole, of not letting people serve parts of their sentences in the community. And yet Poilievre is committed to undoing all of these efforts that the TRC explicitly says are harmful to Indigenous people. So what are your thoughts about this kind of all-out assault on something that he takes credit for, by the way? Because if you ask Pierre Poilievre about this subject, he'll say, we, in the Harper era, when I was there, we actually brought in the TRC, so we're to be credited for that. Just forget about the recommendations.
Ew. Okay, so this is a criminal injustice plan, and I don't have to tell you two that. What we're talking about here is he is proposing a gross and grave breach of not just the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for all Canadians, but also human rights in general, but the specific human rights of Indigenous peoples, knowing that we are in such a terrible criminal justice system that Black and Indigenous peoples are disproportionately profiled and arrested, beaten, killed by police, incarcerated, less likely to get parole, all of that stuff. So knowing that that's the case, and they're less likely to get help and supports once they're out of prison, to make it even tougher and to have even more mandatory minimums, which some mandatory minimums have already been challenged in court and found to be unconstitutional. So I don't know how he thinks he's above the Constitution or the Supreme Court of Canada to imagine that he could re-invoke those or have even more. I just don't see it happening. And I think he knows that. I think he knows he won't be able to do everything that he is proposing to do, but he's playing to the racist element in this Conservative Party, the very, very far right, the ones that say, oh, it's all Black people, it's all Indigenous peoples that we can blame for all of these problems, or immigrants. That's also their new category of people to blame. And so vote for me, and you never have to worry about your car getting stolen again, knowing that there is no police officer in the history that I've known that's ever stopped a car from getting stolen. They might bring it back. They might be able to chase people down after it's happened, but you're not stopping people from breaking in. And they're not all Black and Indigenous peoples. It is so frustrating. You can tell I'm a little bit cranky about this, but there's just no way he can do half of the things he's saying. But unfortunately, some of his constituency don't read, don't know about the law. All they care about are these like talking points that sound really cool, but will just cause a horrible situation for Black and Indigenous peoples in particular. And for Indigenous peoples who have the highest incarceration rates, women just continue to skyrocket. We're well over 50%, even youth corrections. And he wants to crack down on youth too. That's what he had said previously. Already in youth corrections, in some provinces, we're 100% of those that are in youth corrections. Like, what more do you want? Like, 200%? It makes no sense. Statistically, in a social science kind of way, human rights kind of way, in a social justice, even in a constitutional world. You can't do it, but he will try, I fear.
We're all concerned about this. And I want to follow up on this, Pam, because you brought in the police, which are the other side of this, is that this is who's doing the apprehending and the policing in communities. And there was a period of 11 days last summer in 2024 when 6 Indigenous people across this country were killed by police in different circumstances. 6 people killed in 11 days across Canada. It barely registered in the national media. The Assembly of First Nations has made a call now to have some kind of a federal investigation into why RCMP and other forces are killing so many Indigenous people. I know we've been down this road before. I want your thoughts on those calls for an inquiry into police killings of Indigenous people.
It boggles my mind. I've been working on this for almost 20 years. I helped the UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women come and meet with different Indigenous peoples across the country to talk about police sexualized violence against Indigenous women, over-incarceration, the problems in particular with the RCMP, but not only the RCMP. And we made recommendations that there be a national inquiry, an empowering inquiry, where you have the power to compel testimony, compel evidence, not the wishy-washy stuff where police unions come in and say, no, we're not doing anything. And she accepted our recommendations, and she made that as a recommendation for Canada. So this is old news. We, like, Native women and Native people have been calling for an inquiry for a very long time, but you saw during COVID. What happened at the height of the pandemic, when we were bound to our houses during the COVID-19 pandemic? We had some of the highest numbers of police killings of Indigenous peoples, including little girls. I mean, tell me that big strapping police officers armed with batons and tasers and mace and guns see a little girl, and there's no way that you could subdue her, even if you were fearful. And that's just a racist stereotype that we're all very threatening. You can't subdue a little girl. I'm sorry. There's no excuses for any of these things. And of course we should have an inquiry. I don't know where the AFN has been. They have never supported our calls for an inquiry before, but now they're acting like, oh, I guess we better say something because we've been calling out the AFN. Where are you? Where's the Native Women's Association of Canada? Where's the Métis National Council? Where are all of these organizations on the threat? Like, it is one of the things that we in the community fear the most. Please, whatever you do, don't call the cops unless you have to. Because one of the kids that were shot and killed had actually called the cops for help. He felt that he was in danger. But anyway, yes, the moral of my story, long-winded story, is yes, a national inquiry. We're long overdue. And in particular, there needs to be one about the RCMP, because this business Trudeau said about, oh, maybe they will just take on a different role, having them in national security. Hello, that's how we became targets and assumed to be domestic threats to, national infrastructure.
Pam, your long-windedness is always welcome here.
No, especially because Pam, I know Pam's training has been in duking it out in like 30-second spurts on the mainstream media where she doesn't get time to go long. So I always treasure the opportunities when Pam can actually give us the breadth of her analysis.
Likewise. So Pam, we mentioned resource development a little bit before, And we talked about, the threats to free, prior, and informed consent when we have things like, the conservative proposal about one and done environmental assessments, and maybe even reducing some of the environmental, requirements for developing pipelines and other infrastructure projects in Canada. But we have this larger narrative now with Trump threatening Canada that obviously pipelines are a thing we need again. We don't know exactly which projects. Some of the projects that were proposed in the past are dead now and probably won't be revived. We talked about that last week. But just your thoughts in general about the idea that the oil in the ground, the gas in the ground is going to protect us from Donald Trump.
So I get it. And I agree with the general idea that in terms of national security, public safety, our ability to, have our own energy, we should have done this a long time ago when Trump first got elected. We should have been able to see the writing on the wall. We should not be reliant on any country to the extent possible. We're all interdependent. That's not going to change. But to be energy self-sufficient, that's a good goal to have. But the idea that the only path to being energy self-sufficient is oil and gas just frustrates me so much. What about renewable energy? What about all of the other countries in the world that are taking to wind energy, wave energy, water energy? Like, we should be investing. That would create jobs. Think about all of the people that are losing jobs because of these tariffs. Well, we could be retraining or using the people who are already trained to invest in green energy. Why can't we do both until we're no longer reliant on non-renewable resources and earth-destructing resources and grave human rights engaging resources? Why can't it be both, at least in the interim? And it doesn't always assume that pipelines are absolutely necessary, and certainly not over and under major waterways and places where Indigenous peoples are living. There's always an alternative. And don't forget the Supreme Court of Canada. It's not just UNRIP that said free, prior, and informed consent. The standard of the Chilcotin case is consultation, accommodation, and in most cases, consent. So we have a very high standard that governments seem to forget about. They are not going to be able to railroad this. Mind you, they have the army and they have, their own police forces. So that's a bit of an impediment. But legally, I think we have grounds to stop any fast forwarding of that when there are alternatives.
I guess one thing to add is that part of the push, for this doubling down on resource extraction is coming in the wake of the crisis created by Trump. And I think what we've seen from Poilievre is also a willingness to embrace that much older agenda of resource pillage on Indigenous lands. And Pam mentioned FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. And I guess it's worth mentioning. In the research for my book on Poilievre, I came across this speech that he gave back in 2021. It was when the Liberals were finally going to pass legislation, C-15, around UNRIP. And most Conservatives just kind of quietly registered their opposition. Poilievre actually stood up in Parliament and said that he was very proud to say that he opposes this bill. And he then talked about freedom and how much he loves freedom and how much Manny Jules, his closest collaborator among First Nations, loves freedom. And then he had the gall to say that the UN Declaration would actually, quote, fail to extend and return those freedoms. I mean, that was shocking because freedom is mentioned, I think, almost 10 times in the Declaration. And one of the most important principles is the right to free, prior, informed consent. But that's not the kind of freedom that Poilievre has in mind. I think that what he means by freedom when it comes to Indigenous peoples is the freedom to participate in a no-holds-barred capitalist economy. And one of the key aspects of this, which is not a new idea, but an age-old push, is private property on Indigenous lands. And Poilievre, I think, if he gets elected, would bring back with vengeance a conservative plan to try to break apart collectively held land on Indigenous traditional territories. And I think that has been something that the Canadian government has been trying to do on and off since the 1840s. And what that ultimately is ensuring that Indigenous peoples and their land rights will not be a barrier to untrammeled extraction. I think Idle No More has taught increasingly more Canadians and the Indigenous rights movement of the last, 15 years that Indigenous rights are the best defense that we have against endless resource extraction and climate torching pipelines and projects. And I think Poilievre very much is keen to bust apart that ability that Indigenous peoples have to be that defense for themselves and for all of us. And then there's one other aspect which I find interesting about his resource push. He said something really interesting in his speech in February in the wake of the Trump tariffs, where he said, he was pushing this idea of, giving Indigenous peoples greater opportunities in the resource extraction. And he said, and by the way, and this was an ad-lib moment, he said, that will also allow First Nations to spend that money on clean drinking water and a better future for their people. And I found that fascinating because to me, that was a telltale indication that he is wanting to offload the government's responsibilities onto First Nations. And those two aspects, breaking apart Indigenous collectively held lands and offloading Crown responsibilities, are to me the two pillars of the fundamental genocidal colonial project in this country. And in kind of offhand ways, and in his own parliamentary record, Poilievre has indicated that he is committed to that very aggressive colonial agenda.
Pam, we're going to give you the last word this week and ask you just, the dark clouds are gathering, it seems, given these two options that we have before us for this election, that policy is going to shift rightward in terms of Canada's relationship with and dealing with Indigenous peoples. We have seen in the past in this country, in the past decade for sure, the way that advocacy, organizing, and when necessary, direct action has risen up in response to these kinds of shifts in government policy. When Trudeau talked about reconciliation but didn't deliver, people were out in the streets. People were up at the blockades. Even just going back to the beginnings of Idle No More with Teresa Spence and the hunger strikes, we've seen Indigenous nations respond time and time again when the government doesn't deliver on its promise or when crises emerge. What do you see in the upcoming few years, no matter who it is that gets into office?
Here's how I see this very dark election. And it is dark in like so many ways, some of the things we've talked about. It's that, we're not going to get what we want out of this election. I can guarantee you that. Like, it doesn't matter what the result is. There's a two-part goal right now. One is to keep the worst guy out, like the absolute worst guy, Poilievre. And then the other goal really is to put pressure on this Liberal government. And I think he needs to recognize we're at a different playing field now. This is not the old days. Send in your army, send in the RCMP, but we're united. If that's one thing that Black Lives Matter and the environmentalist movement and Idle No More has shown us, is that we're all together now, which is what conservative advisors like Tom Flanagan had said the worst case scenario for Canada is if all these groups got together. Well, we're together now, and we have made a monumental difference, even if Canadians don't realize what's happening. Look at when these racist fishermen were burning down Mi'kmaq traps and trying to stop us from fishing lobster, and the RCMP was just sitting there letting them beat up our chief. What happened? Restaurants stopped buying from those racist fishermen. We started being able to sell to American restaurants, to other people. So there's things that happen that people don't see. We make a difference every single time we stand up. And now Carney's got to know, Canadians are upset about Trump, But we're in a different world now. They also care about human rights. They care about the environment. They care about their kids' futures. And they certainly care about Indigenous peoples and Black people and everybody else who has been abused and neglected for decades. So I have hope that no matter what happens, like where the Liberals stand, whether they're majority or minority, that we got this. We have the power to force them to do the things we need them to do.
And that's where we'll leave it this week. Pam Palmater of the Eel River Bar First Nation, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you. It's fun with you guys.
Thanks, Pam.
And of course, Martin Lukacs, managing editor of The Breach, thank you again for your commentary this week. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened this week. We've got a couple of more of these leading up to the federal election on April 28th. And don't forget that on the evening of April 28th, you can tune in to us at The Breach for live election coverage, including the live and up-to-the-minute election results as they come in across the country. We're going to have interviews with people across the country live, and we hope Pam will join us, and we hope to have a whole bunch of guests there. So please stay tuned for more information about the live election evening. If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show today, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.